April 24th, 1966, 2:23 p.m. Local time, airspace 40 miles northwest of Hanoi. Major Paul Gilmore saw them first. 4 silver dots at 20,000 feet, rising from the haze above the Red River. His intercept radar, in the nose of the F-4C Phantom, locked onto targets at 12 miles. But Gilmore didn't need electronics to understand what was happening. The silhouette shape was unmistakable. The characteristic triangular profile, short cropped wings, single tail fin. MiG-21, not a Chinese copy, not a trainer variant. Real Soviet fighters rolled off the assembly line at the Gorky plant less than a year ago, crewed by North Vietnamese pilots who 3 months earlier had been training in Krasnodar. The Phantom shuddered as Gilmore engaged afterburners on both J-79 engines. Airspeed 480 knots and climbing. Altitude 18,500 feet, range to target 10 miles and closing. His weapons officer in the back seat, Captain Robert Anderson, was already configuring the AIM-7 Sparrow guidance system, trying to acquire a radar lock through the electronic noise that filled all airspace over North Vietnam. What Gilmore didn't know in that moment was that one of those MiG-21s was piloted by Senior Lieutenant Nguyen Van Cock, who had already shot down 2 American aircraft and would become one of the most successful Vietnamese aces of the war. He didn't know that Soviet instructors had spent the last 8 weeks training North Vietnamese pilots in specific hit-and-run tactics designed specifically against heavy American fighters. He didn't know that the RP-21 intercept radar in the nose of that MiG could acquire targets at the same range as his own. A technological parity Americans did not expect to encounter over the jungles of Southeast Asia. The MiGs turned. Not panicked, not chaotic, coordinated, professional, like pilots who knew their aircraft and their tactics. Gilmore fired his first Sparrow at 8 miles. The missile came off the rail in a cloud of white smoke and streaked forward, its semi-active guidance system seeking the reflection of radar energy from the target. Miss. The missile passed wide, confused by jamming or simply defeated by the target's sharp maneuver. The second Sparrow, same result. By the time the range closed to 2 miles, the MiGs were already departing, diving toward the deck on afterburner, using terrain and speed to break contact. The Phantom was faster at altitude, but the MiG-21 was nimbler, lighter, deadlier in the vertical. Gilmore turned back toward Da Nang, his fuel at minimum, his frustration at maximum. No results, no hits. Only the bitter understanding that Soviet technology and Soviet tactics had transformed the airspace over Hanoi into something entirely different from the training ranges in Nevada. What neither Gilmore nor the Soviet designers of the MiG-21, nor the instructors in Krasnodar understood, was that every second of this engagement was being recorded. Cameras aboard the Phantom captured trajectories, ground tracking. Radars noted altitudes and speeds. Intelligence analysts were already preparing reports on enemy tactics. Within 6 weeks, this data would feed into pilot training programs. Within 3 months, the U.S. Air Force would establish a specialized air combat school at Nellis. Within a year, the Have Donut program would emerge, a classified project in which American pilots would train against an actual MiG-21, secretly obtained through a third country. Because the Soviet Union had made a miscalculation. It had given the Americans a concrete adversary, concrete parameters, a concrete problem. And when it came to converting tactical defeats into systematic victories, analyzing every enemy maneuver and creating solutions faster than the adversary could adapt, the equation always resolved in America's favor. The war for air superiority was just beginning. And this was a war not of courage, but of adaptation cycles. In that mathematics, the Soviets lost from the first shot. American air superiority over Vietnam was not won through inherent technological supremacy. It was forged through a system of adaptation that operated at velocities the Soviet supply chain could not match. The central thesis of this narrative is unassailable. Victory was determined not by the quality of weapons, but by the speed of learning. The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. Soviet designers in Moscow created weapons: the SA-2 surface-to-air missile, the MiG-17 and MiG-21 fighters, early warning radars, and shipped them to Hanoi. This process consumed months. American intelligence identified these weapons, dissected their weaknesses, and fielded countermeasures. This process required weeks. The delta between these two cycles determined who lived and who died at 20,000 feet over the Red River Delta. Consider the raw numbers that defined this technological duel. Between 1965 and 1968, the Soviet Union delivered approximately 95 SA-2 batteries to North Vietnam, accompanied by supporting radars and over 7,000 missiles. Each battery represented the cutting edge of Soviet air defense technology, the same system that had humiliated the CIA by downing Gary Powers' U-2 over Sverdlovsk in 1960. The North Vietnamese deployed these batteries in an integrated air defense network more sophisticated than anything protecting Moscow itself. Soviet advisors, numbering in the thousands, trained Vietnamese crews in facilities across the country. Soviet technicians maintained the equipment with meticulous precision. Soviet doctrine dictated the tactics, honed through decades of Cold War preparation. The Americans lost aircraft. The psychological impact was immediate and severe. In 1965 alone, SA-2 missiles claimed 15 American jets. Pilots who had trained to dominate the sky now faced an invisible enemy that could reach them at any altitude. The F-105 Thunder Chief, the workhorse of the bombing campaign against North Vietnam, earned a grim nickname among the men who flew it: Thud, because that was the sound it made hitting the ground. Each loss represented not just a multi-million-dollar aircraft destroyed, but a trained pilot dead or captured, a family devastated, a squadron demoralized. But here the narrative diverges from simple technological competition and enters the realm where American ingenuity transformed tactical defeats into systematic victories. The Soviet system produced weapons and exported them. The American system produced something fundamentally different. It produced learning. Every SA-2 launch was recorded by electronic intelligence aircraft, EC-121 Warning Stars and EB-66 destroyers, orbiting on the periphery of North Vietnamese airspace. Every radar signal was captured, digitized, analyzed by teams of engineers and intelligence specialists working around the clock. The APR-25 radar warning receiver, standard equipment on American strike aircraft by late 1965, didn't just alert pilots to threats. It recorded the exact frequency, pulse repetition rate, and signal strength of every enemy radar transmission. This data flowed back to the United States at a rate Soviet planners never anticipated and could not comprehend. Engineers at Applied Technology in California, working in classified facilities in Mountain View, received updated threat profiles weekly, sometimes daily. They knew the Fan Song guidance radar, the heart of the SA-2 system, operated at 2,700 to 2,800 MHz. They knew it required 27 seconds from initial target acquisition to missile launch, an eternity in aerial combat. They knew its maximum effective range against maneuvering targets was 17 nautical miles. They knew the radar's scan pattern, its power output, its vulnerability windows. More importantly, they knew these parameters faster than Soviet technicians could modify them in the field, faster than Moscow could develop and ship upgrades. The result was the AGM-45 Shrike anti-radiation missile, operational by early 1966. Shrike was not elegant. Its seeker head could only home on a narrow band of frequencies, making it vulnerable to simple countermeasures. Its 145-pound warhead was small, often insufficient to destroy hardened radar installations. Its range was limited to 12 miles, forcing launch aircraft into the envelope of other defenses. But Shrike didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be fast. From the first recorded fan song signal over North Vietnam to the first operational Shrike launch took 11 months. 11 months to convert raw intelligence into a weapon that could kill a radar from 12 miles away, forcing Vietnamese operators to make an impossible choice. Keep the radar on and guide missiles to their targets, or shut down to avoid destruction and render the entire battery useless. The Wild Weasel program emerged from this same philosophy of rapid adaptation. The concept was audacious to the point of madness. Take the F-100F Super Sabre, an aging fighter designed for air superiority, never intended for the mission, and pack it with electronic warfare equipment. Train two-man crews to deliberately provoke SAM launches by flying directly toward radar sites, then destroy those sites with Shrikes or cluster bombs in the seconds before the missiles arrived. The first Wild Weasel missions flew in November 1965, just months after the concept was conceived. Crews adopted the motto, "First in, last out," acknowledging their role as the tip of the spear, the most vulnerable aircraft in any strike package. By March 1966, they were claiming confirmed kills against SA-2 sites. By late 1967, the upgraded F-105F Thunder Chief had replaced the F-100. Carrying more sophisticated jamming pods, improved threat warning systems, and the new AGM-78 Standard Arm with extended range and enhanced capabilities. Each iteration refined the system with surgical precision. Each destroyed radar provided data for the next generation of countermeasures. Each survived engagement fed back into training programs. The Soviets responded by modifying tactics, turning radars on for shorter periods to minimize exposure, using optical tracking systems to guide missiles when electronic systems were jammed, deploying dummy sites to waste American ordnance. The Americans adapted faster. The ALQ-87 jamming pod entered service in 1966, generating false targets on Vietnamese radar screens, creating phantom aircraft that diverted missiles from real targets. The AGM-78 Standard Arm, operational by 1968, featured an inertial memory unit that represented a quantum leap in capability. If the target radar shut down after detecting the missile launch, Standard Arm continued to the last known position, diving on those coordinates with lethal accuracy. This single technological advance changed the tactical equation fundamentally. Vietnamese operators could no longer simply turn off their radars to defeat incoming anti-radiation missiles. They had to physically relocate their equipment. A process that took hours, required vehicles, crews, coordination, and exposed the battery to detection during movement. This was the essence of American innovation. Engineers closing the loop between threat identification and countermeasure deployment faster than Soviet supply chains could deliver new equipment to Southeast Asia. It wasn't about building better missiles or faster fighters in isolation. It was about constructing a system that learned faster than the enemy could adapt, that turned every engagement into data, every loss into a lesson, every tactical defeat into the seed of future victory. The air-to-air war narrated the same story through different numbers, different aircraft, but the same underlying pattern of American adaptation overwhelming Soviet technology. When the MiG-21 Fishbed arrived over North Vietnam in 1966, it represented the apex of Soviet fighter design. A sleek, deadly interceptor capable of Mach 2 at altitude, armed with heat-seeking K-13 ATOL missiles, reverse-engineered from American Sidewinders captured by the Chinese, flown by pilots trained at Soviet academies in Krasnodar and Armavir. The North Vietnamese Air Force, with intensive Soviet backing, developed a sophisticated ground-controlled intercept system that leveraged the MiG-21's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. Soviet-supplied radars tracked American strike packages from the moment they crossed into North Vietnamese airspace. Controllers vectored MiGs to optimal intercept positions with precision. The fighters struck fast, fired their missiles, and disengaged before American escorts could respond. Classic hit-and-run tactics, refined through years of Soviet air defense doctrine. In the first 6 months of 1966, this system worked with devastating effectiveness. The MiG-21's ATOL missiles claimed 4 American aircraft. The fighter's superior acceleration in the vertical allowed it to disengage from unfavorable encounters, diving away on afterburner before American F-4 Phantoms could bring their weapons to bear. Vietnamese pilots, many trained directly by Soviet instructors, demonstrated proficiency that shocked American commanders accustomed to viewing Asian adversaries as technically inferior. Senior Lieutenant Nguyen Van Cock, who would become Vietnam's highest-scoring ace with 9 confirmed kills, epitomized this new threat. Professionally trained, tactically sound, flying a world-class fighter. But again, the Americans were recording everything. Gun camera footage captured MiG-21 flight profiles, documenting turn rates, acceleration characteristics, energy management. Electronic intelligence aircraft recorded the frequencies used by North Vietnamese ground controllers, mapping the entire command and control architecture. Debriefing reports from every engagement, victories, defeats, and the ambiguous encounters in between, fed into a growing database of enemy tactics maintained by intelligence units. The pattern became clear through systematic analysis. MiG-21s operated under rigid ground control, executing pre-planned intercept profiles with limited flexibility for improvisation. This was a strength against undisciplined opponents, but a fatal weakness against an enemy that learned to exploit it. The American response came in layers, each building upon the others. First, tactical adaptation at the squadron level. Fighter sweeps began deliberately trolling for MiGs, using strike packages as bait while maintaining combat air patrol stations at optimal intercept positions. The legendary Bolo operation on January 2, 1967, exemplified this approach with devastating results. F-4 Phantoms from the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, led by Colonel Robin Olds, a World War II ace and one of the Air Force's most aggressive tacticians, mimicked the radar signature and flight profile of F-105 strike aircraft. When MiG-21s rose to intercept what they believed were vulnerable bombers laden with ordnance, they found Phantoms instead, flown by pilots specifically trained for this engagement. 7 MiGs fell in a single afternoon, nearly 20% of North Vietnam's MiG-21 fleet destroyed in one carefully orchestrated trap. The psychological impact on North Vietnamese pilots was profound. For weeks afterward, MiG activity dropped precipitously as commanders reassessed their tactics and pilots questioned every target. Second, technological response refined through the industrial base that was America's ultimate strategic advantage. The IM-9D Sidewinder, introduced in 1967, featured improved seeker sensitivity and better resistance to countermeasures compared to earlier variants. The problem wasn't building a better missile. American industry possessed that capacity in abundance. The problem was identifying which specific improvements would counter observed MiG tactics. Did Vietnamese pilots use the sun for thermal masking during disengagement? Engineers upgraded the seeker's infrared filter. Did they execute high-G breaks at specific ranges to defeat missile tracking? Engineers adjusted the guidance logic to maintain lock through violent maneuvers. Each modification was tested, validated, and rushed to operational units in timeframes measured in weeks and months, not the years typical of Soviet development cycles. Third, and most critically for long-term success, institutional adaptation at the strategic level. The Navy established the Fighter Weapons School, later immortalized as TOPGUN, at Naval Air Station Miramar in March 1969. The Air Force created its Fighter Weapons School at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. Both programs emerged from the same brutal realization. American pilots trained to employ technology were losing to Vietnamese pilots trained to fight. The solution wasn't better missiles or more powerful engines. It was better training in how to use those missiles, how to exploit the F-4's strengths, how to mitigate its weaknesses, how to think like a fighter pilot rather than a systems operator. The data supported this conclusion with mathematical clarity. In 1968, the exchange ratio in air combat hovered around 2:1 in America's favor. Hardly the dominant performance expected from a technologically superior force. By 1972, after Top Gun graduates deployed to carriers in significant numbers, the Navy's exchange ratio jumped to 12.51. The aircraft hadn't changed dramatically. The F-4 Phantom was still the F-4 Phantom. The missiles were only incrementally better. The AIM-9G was an evolution of the AIM-9D, not a revolution. What changed was the human system operating, the technology, the tactical knowledge base, the understanding of energy management and angle-off and turn circles that separated good pilots from dead pilots. But even this institutional learning operated within the framework of technological adaptation that characterized the entire American effort. Top Gun's curriculum centered on understanding the MiG-21's flight envelope with scientific precision. Its turn radius at various speeds, its acceleration characteristics from corner velocity, its vulnerability windows in different flight regimes. American pilots trained against A-4 Skyhawks and F-5 Tigers, configured to simulate MiG performance as closely as possible. Later, through classified channels that remain partially obscured even today, the United States obtained actual MiG-21s through defections and third-country transfers. The have-donut and have-drill programs allowed American pilots to fly against real Soviet fighters, mapping their exact capabilities with instrumented precision, discovering nuances no simulation could replicate. The Soviets had no equivalent program and could not create one within their system's constraints. Soviet pilots might fly against captured American equipment, and they did. Testing F-4 Phantoms and F-105s obtained through various means. But the Soviet military-industrial complex lacked the institutional flexibility to rapidly disseminate lessons learned. A Soviet pilot who discovered a tactical nuance against an F-4 Phantom reported it up the chain of command through rigid bureaucratic channels. Months later, after review by multiple committees and approval by political officers concerned with ideological implications, the information might filter back to training programs. The Americans disseminated tactical updates within weeks, sometimes days, through informal networks of instructors who rotated between combat units and training commands. The most intensive technological duel occurred not in the visible spectrum, but in the electromagnetic realm. By 1967, the airspace over North Vietnam had become the world's first fully electronic battlefield. A three-dimensional arena where American strike packages brought not just bombs, but an entire suite of electronic warfare capabilities designed to blind, confuse, and overwhelm North Vietnamese air defenses at frequencies invisible to the human eye. The ALQ-71 jamming pod, carried by EB-66 electronic warfare aircraft orbiting at the periphery of defended airspace, generated high-power noise across multiple frequency bands that degraded radar returns, turning crisp target images into fuzzy blobs. The ALQ-87 pod, mounted on individual strike aircraft, created multiple false targets through sophisticated deception techniques, making one aircraft appear as several on Vietnamese radar screens. The ALQ-101 pod jammed SA-2 guidance radars on specific frequencies identified through signals intelligence. Each system represented a specific answer to a specific Soviet technology, a countermeasure tailored to exploit known vulnerabilities. The North Vietnamese adapted within their constraints, guided by Soviet advisors who understood electronic warfare from defending their own airspace during the Cold War. They introduced home-on-jam modes for SA-2 missiles, allowing them to fly toward the source of jamming when normal guidance failed. They deployed barrage fire tactics, launching missiles without radar guidance into the predicted path of strike packages, saturating airspace with explosives. They mixed modern SA-2 batteries with older, optically guided 57mm and 85mm anti-aircraft guns, forcing American aircraft into medium altitudes where both systems overlapped, creating a deadly gauntlet. The Americans adapted faster, always faster. Wild weasel tactics evolved to target not just the radars themselves, but the associated command and control infrastructure that made the entire system function. If destroying the fan song radar forced the battery offline for hours, while technicians installed a replacement, destroying the generator or the command post forced it offline for days, while engineers rebuilt the facility. Strike packages began carrying a mix of weapons optimized for different targets. Cluster bombs with hundreds of submunitions for soft targets like radar antennas. Laser-guided bombs with 2,000-pound warheads for hardened command bunkers built to withstand conventional attack. The AGM-78 Standard Arm exemplified this evolution from simple countermeasure to sophisticated hunter-killer system. Unlike the earlier Shrike, which lost guidance when the target radar shut down, Standard Arm featured an inertial memory unit that revolutionized anti-radiation warfare. If the target radar shut down after detecting the missile launch, standard Soviet doctrine to defeat incoming weapons, the missile continued to the last known position, diving on those coordinates with its 215-pound warhead. This single feature changed the tactical equation fundamentally. Vietnamese operators could no longer simply turn off their radars to defeat incoming anti-radiation missiles and preserve their equipment. They had to physically relocate their batteries, a process that took hours, required vehicles vulnerable to air attack, and disrupted the entire defensive network. The Soviet response was to supply more sophisticated systems through the pipeline that connected Moscow's design bureaus to Hanoi's airfields. The SA-3 GOA low-altitude missile arrived in 1972, specifically designed to counter low-level penetration tactics that American pilots had adopted to avoid SA-2s. American aircraft that flew low to avoid the SA-2's high-altitude envelope now faced a new threat optimized for that exact altitude band, with faster reaction times and better performance against terrain masking targets. The MiG-21MF arrived with improved avionics packages and better missiles. Soviet technicians introduced new radar frequencies and more sophisticated electronic countermeasures. But each new Soviet system arrived as a complete package, requiring months of shipping across oceans, assembly by specialized technicians, and training for Vietnamese operators who had to learn new procedures. American countermeasures arrived as software updates loaded into existing equipment. New pod configurations flown to Thailand in transport aircraft, or modified tactics disseminated through classified message traffic, changes that could be implemented in weeks. The F-4E, introduced in 1967, carried an internal M61 Vulcan cannon specifically because tactical analysis of air combat showed a need for close-range weapons when missiles failed or rules of engagement prevented their use. The F-105G Wild Weasel, operational by 1970, integrated all previous electronic warfare lessons into a single optimized platform that combined the speed and payload of the Thunder Chief with the latest jamming pods and anti-radiation missiles. The contradictions and culminations of this technological arms race reached their apex during Operation Linebacker in the spring and summer of 1972. By this point, North Vietnam's air defense network represented the most sophisticated Soviet-supplied system deployed outside the Warsaw Pact, a multi-layered fortress of steel and electronics. Over 300 radar sites blanketed the country, tracking everything that moved. 30 active airfields hosted approximately 200 MiG fighters, MiG-17s, MiG-19s, and the deadly MiG-21s. More than 1,500 anti-aircraft artillery sites, ranging from 23mm rapid-fire guns to 100mm heavy batteries, created a curtain of steel through which aircraft had to fly. And critically, upgraded SA-2 batteries with improved guidance systems, supplemented by the new SA-3 and SA-7 man-portable missiles, all operated by Soviet-trained crews with years of combat experience. Men who had learned their trade under fire and survived. The Americans, in turn, brought capabilities refined through 7 years of technological iteration and tactical evolution. Laser-guided bombs that could destroy individual buildings, even specific rooms within buildings, with the first bomb rather than requiring dozens of sorties. Advanced jamming pods that covered multiple threat frequencies simultaneously, creating electronic havens within enemy airspace. Fighter pilots trained at TOPGUN and Red Flag, the Air Force's realistic combat training program at Nellis, to exploit specific weaknesses in Soviet equipment that had been painstakingly documented. Wild Weasels equipped with the AGM-78 Standard Arm and sophisticated threat warning systems that provided 360-degree coverage and automatic threat prioritization. The results validated the thesis with brutal clarity. In the first week of Linebacker, American losses were higher than anticipated. 21 aircraft to all causes, including surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, and MiGs. Each loss was analyzed immediately, the circumstances documented, the lessons extracted and disseminated. But the trend line was clear and irreversible. As tactics refined in response to observed threats and countermeasures adjusted based on real-world performance, the loss rate declined with mathematical precision. By week 3, losses had dropped to single digits despite maintaining the same sortie rate, the same targets, the same defended airspace. By week 6, American strike packages were penetrating the Hanoi-Haiphong area, the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, defended more thoroughly than Moscow itself, with predictable regularity and acceptable losses. The critical engagement occurred on May 10, 1972, a day that would become legend in American air combat history. 8 F-4 Phantoms from the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing engaged a large force of MiG-17s and MiG-21s over Hanoi, in conditions that should have favored the defenders. Short-range, ground-controlled intercepts, defenders operating over their own territory with unlimited fuel and the option to disengage at will. In the 12-minute engagement that followed, American pilots shot down 5 MiGs without loss. The exchange ratio that day, 5-0, reflected 7 years of systematic adaptation, 7 years of converting tactical defeats into training scenarios, 7 years of American pilots learning to fight rather than merely operate systems. What made this possible was not individual heroism, though that certainly existed in abundance among men who flew into the most dangerous airspace in history. It was system-level learning, institutional knowledge converted into tactical advantage. The F-4 crews had trained against simulated MiGs that replicated actual performance characteristics. They understood the MiG-21's turn radius at 15,000 feet and 450 knots. Not theoretically, but practically, from having flown against it in controlled conditions. They knew the optimal range bracket for the AM-7E2 Sparrow, the specific closure rates that maximize probability of kill. They had practiced the specific defensive maneuvers that defeated the Atoll heat-seeking missile, understanding its seeker limitations and its vulnerability to flares and hard brakes. Each piece of knowledge came from analysis of previous engagements, from gun camera footage studied frame by frame, from debriefs conducted hours after combat, from intelligence reports compiled by analysts who never left air-conditioned offices, but whose work saved lives at 20,000 feet. The final accounting was brutal in its implications for Soviet military planning. Between 1965 and 1972, the Soviet Union delivered approximately 2,000 aircraft to North Vietnam, 7,500 SA-2 missiles, thousands of anti-aircraft guns, and support equipment worth billions of rubles. Soviet advisors numbered in the thousands, rotating through tours that exposed them to American tactics and technology. Soviet training programs processed hundreds of Vietnamese pilots and technicians in academies across the USSR. The result was an air defense system that, on paper, should have made American air operations prohibitively expensive in both aircraft and lives. The Americans lost 818 aircraft to all causes over North Vietnam during the main combat period. Each loss was a tragedy. A pilot dead or captured, a family devastated, a multi-million-dollar aircraft destroyed. But examined through the cold lens of technological competition, the exchange was starkly asymmetrical in ways that Soviet planners had not anticipated. The United States destroyed approximately 195 North Vietnamese aircraft in air-to-air combat. American ground fire and bombing destroyed hundreds more MiGs on the ground, catching them during takeoff, landing, or parked on airfields. Shrike and Standard Arm missiles destroyed more than 600 radar systems, forcing the North Vietnamese to cannibalize damaged batteries to keep others operational. More critically, for understanding the underlying dynamics, the loss rate declined over time. Irrefutable evidence of successful adaptation. In 1966, American forces lost 1 aircraft for every 40 sorties over North Vietnam. By 1972, that rate had improved to 1 loss per 400 sorties, a tenfold improvement. The threat hadn't decreased. If anything, North Vietnamese air defenses were more sophisticated in 1972 than in 1966, with more missiles, more radars, more experienced crews. What changed was American capability to counter those threats, to neutralize them through electronic warfare, to suppress them through wild weasel strikes, to avoid them through intelligence-driven route planning. The Soviet system could not match this adaptation speed due to fundamental structural limitations. When the SA-2 proved vulnerable to wild weasel attacks, the Soviet response was to develop the SA-3, a years-long process involving design at research institutes, testing at ranges, production at factories, and deployment through a supply chain that stretched thousands of miles. When the MiG-21 proved vulnerable to new American tactics, documented through gun camera footage and intelligence reports, the Soviet response was the MiG-21 AMF, with improved avionics. Again, a multi-year development cycle constrained by bureaucratic approval processes and production capacity. The Americans operated inside the Soviet decision cycle with systematic precision. By the time new Soviet equipment arrived in Vietnam, American countermeasures were already in development, or, in some cases, in operational testing. The AGM-78 entered service specifically to counter improved SA-2 tactics observed in combat. The F-4E received an internal gun because analysis of air combat engagements showed that 40% of encounters ended at ranges where missiles couldn't be employed due to minimum range limitations or rules of engagement. The ALQ-1119 jamming pod answered the SA-3 threat within months of its first appearance, carrying software specifically tuned to that system's radar frequencies. Each response came faster than the Soviets anticipated, faster than their supply chain could adjust, faster than their doctrine could evolve. Soviet military analysts understood what had happened, though their reports remained classified for decades. Marshal Pavel Batitsky, head of Soviet air defense forces during the critical period, later acknowledged in restricted circulation military journals that American electronic warfare capabilities had evolved faster than Soviet countermeasures could be developed and deployed. A classified Soviet assessment from 1973, partially declassified decades later, noted with bureaucratic understatement that the time from American identification of a threat to deployment of a countermeasure averaged 9 to 12 months. A cycle the Soviet system could not match given the constraints of centralized planning, production bottlenecks, and the logistics of supporting a client state thousands of miles from Soviet borders. Vietnamese accounts reinforced this conclusion from the perspective of those who fought the war directly. Nguyen Van Cock, the MiG-21 pilot who became Vietnam's highest-scoring ace, later described in interviews the experience as fighting an enemy that learned from every engagement with systematic thoroughness. His fourth kill came relatively easily, exploiting American unfamiliarity with ground-controlled intercept tactics. His later attempts grew progressively harder as American pilots adapted their tactics specifically to counter the techniques he had successfully employed, forcing him to innovate constantly or risk becoming predictable and therefore vulnerable. American post-war analysis was more direct and less constrained by political considerations. The Navy's ALT report, examining air-to-air combat effectiveness with brutal honesty, concluded that institutional learning, embodied in programs like TOPGUN, was worth more than incremental technology improvements in producing combat-effective aircrew. The Air Force's Red Baron studies reached similar conclusions through different analytical methods: systematic analysis of combat results, rapid dissemination of lessons learned through formal and informal channels, and realistic training that replicated combat stress produced better results than simply building more sophisticated weapons and assuming superior technology would prevail. Soviet military theorist General Makhmut Ghariev, writing in the 1980s with the benefit of hindsight, noted that the Vietnam War demonstrated the limitations of supplying technology without the supporting institutional infrastructure to learn from its employment. The Soviet Union had given North Vietnam world-class equipment. The SA-2 was a capable missile. The MiG-21 was a deadly fighter. Soviet radars were sophisticated and well-designed. What the Soviet Union could not give was the system that learned faster than the enemy could adapt, that converted every engagement into data for improvement, that closed the loop between tactical employment and strategic development in timeframes measured in weeks rather than years. The technological arms race in the skies over Vietnam was never a fair contest, but not for the reasons commonly assumed. American technology was not uniformly superior. Soviet equipment was often excellent, sometimes even superior in specific parameters. The SA-2 was a capable long-range missile with good altitude performance. The MiG-21 was a deadly point defense interceptor with excellent acceleration. Soviet radars were sophisticated and, in some cases, more resistant to jamming than American planners anticipated. The asymmetry was institutional, systemic, fundamental. The Soviet system designed weapons, produced them, and exported them, a process measured in years and constrained by centralized planning. The American system identified threats, analyzed vulnerabilities, developed countermeasures, tested them, produced them, and deployed them, a process measured in months and accelerated by industrial capacity that could surge production when needed. This delta, this gap in adaptation cycles, determined the outcome with mathematical certainty. American air superiority over Vietnam was won not by better weapons in isolation, but by a better system for developing, employing, and improving those weapons. It was won by engineers who could design a new jamming pod in months. It was won by intelligence analysts who could identify enemy radar frequencies and disseminate that information within days. It was won by pilots who trained against realistic threats and learned from their mistakes in peacetime, so they wouldn't die from them in combat. It was won by an institutional culture that viewed every tactical defeat as a problem to be solved rather than a failure to be blamed. By 1972, American pilots flying the same F-4 Phantom that had struggled against MiG-21s in 1966 were achieving kill ratios Soviet planners had deemed impossible. The aircraft hadn't fundamentally changed. It was still a two-seat, twin-engine fighter designed for fleet defense and adapted for air superiority. The missiles were only incrementally better. The AIM-9G was an evolution of earlier Sidewinders, not a revolution. What changed was everything else: the tactics, the training, the electronic warfare support, the intelligence that identified threats before the mission. The lessons that were learned from every engagement and incorporated into the next sortie's planning. This was the mathematics that mattered. Not the explosive yield of bombs or the numbers of sorties flown, but the speed of the learning cycle. The rate at which tactical experience converted into institutional knowledge. The velocity at which problems identified in combat became solutions deployed to operational units. In that equation, America held an advantage that Soviet technology alone could never overcome. The advantage of a system designed to learn, adapt, and improve faster than the enemy could respond. The war in the air over Vietnam was won not by better weapons, but by better learning and in that fundamental mathematics of institutional adaptation. The outcome was never truly in doubt. The Soviet Union had given North Vietnam an air defense system that should have been impregnable. What they couldn't give was the system that learned faster than the enemy could adapt. That system, that institutional culture of rapid innovation and relentless improvement, was uniquely American. Built on an industrial base that could respond to threats with unprecedented speed, on an officer corps trained to think critically rather than follow doctrine rigidly, on an engineering culture that valued practical solutions over theoretical elegance. The legacy of this technological duel extended far beyond Vietnam's borders. The lessons learned over Hanoi shaped American military development for decades. The systems developed to counter Soviet technology, Wild Weasel aircraft, HARM missiles, advanced electronic warfare pods, became the foundation of American air warfare doctrine. The institutional practices, realistic training, rapid dissemination of tactics, systematic analysis of combat results, became embedded in how the American military prepared for war. The fundamental understanding that adaptation speed mattered more than initial technological advantage became a cornerstone of American military planning. For the Soviet Union, Vietnam represented a strategic miscalculation that would echo through the remaining decades of the Cold War. They had provided their client state with world-class equipment and expected that equipment to prevail through technological superiority. What they discovered, at tremendous cost in prestige and resources, was that technology alone was insufficient against an enemy that learned faster, adapted quicker, and possessed the industrial capacity to convert lessons learned into operational capabilities measured in weeks and months rather than years. This lesson would haunt Soviet military planners through their invasion of Afghanistan and ultimately contribute to their recognition that the USSR could not compete with American military innovation in the long term. The young pilots who trained at TOPGUN and Red Flag, who learned to exploit MiG-21 weaknesses documented through classified programs, would eventually lead the American military in later conflicts. The engineers who designed jamming pods and anti-radiation missiles would go on to create the stealth aircraft that rendered Soviet-era air defenses obsolete. The intelligence analysts who mapped North Vietnamese radar networks would refine the techniques used to plan the opening strikes of future wars. The institutional culture of rapid adaptation, forged in the deadly skies over Vietnam, would become America's most enduring military advantage. An advantage that no adversary has successfully countered to this day.